Good evening. Tonight's story begins in the quiet hours after a medieval wedding. When the feast was over, the wine had run out, and the guests had gone home. The real ceremony began. Because in 1347, a marriage wasn't official until it was consummated. And that meant one thing: the bride had to prove it. With her body. Whether she was ready or not. Tonight we'll talk about what actually happened in that room. What she knew, what she didn't, and what the church, the village, and even her own family expected her to endure. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. Let this story carry you. And if you're still awake at the end, I'll be here to say goodnight. We begin in 1347, in a region that could be anywhere from the rolling valleys of Yorkshire to the hilltop villages of Provence. Geography mattered less than status. Because the truth is, whether you were born in a drafty stone manor or a one-room wattle and daub cottage, your wedding night had already been decided, long before your wedding dress was even sewn. In most cases, you didn't choose your husband. Your parents did. Or your lord did. Or your parish priest strongly encouraged a union that would keep you safe. Safe, of course, meaning useful. Obedient. Ideally fertile. The betrothal process itself wasn't always the solemn, church-bound ritual we might imagine. In fact, marriage could be legally sealed by something as simple as the exchange of vows in front of witnesses. No church, no priest, no candles. Just two people, one usually much older than the other, and a mutual promise made under pressure. This was called a verba de presenti, words of the present, and once those were spoken, the couple was married in the eyes of God and man. Convenient, yes. Romantic? Not particularly. But don't worry, things got more awkward. Because by the time the actual wedding feast happened, if you were lucky enough to have one, you were likely already legally, morally, and socially bound to this person. And everyone knew it. The baker knew it. Your childhood friend knew it. The man who used to flirt with you at the well knew it. You were no longer a maiden, even if nothing physical had happened yet. And this is where the pressure started to build. You see, in 14th century Europe, marriage was not just a spiritual union. It was a legal contract of access. It granted the husband rights, not over just your household or your labor, but your body. You became, quite literally, his property. And no one needed to sugarcoat that. Even the church wasn't shy about it. In fact, they openly taught that a wife's duty was to yield herself, without resistance, for the sake of her husband's virtue. Because, if he couldn't sleep with you, he might be tempted by the neighbor. Or worse, tempted by Satan. And if that happened, guess whose fault it would be? Right. Yours. This was the moral logic women were steeped in. Not whispered or implied, but preached. Taught. Expected. And accepted. So imagine the lead up to that first night. The wedding feast is over. The guests are drunk. The chickens have been chased out of the house. And now, whether you were 15 or 25, virgin or widow, frightened or numb, you were expected to make your husband feel like a king. Even if he smelled like onions and old wool. Even if you'd only just met him 3 weeks ago. Even if your body was tense with dread and your mind was halfway out the door. But what mattered most, was that you complied. Because this wasn't just sex. This was duty. This was reputation. This was, in some cases, life or death. And sometimes, it came with an audience. But we'll get to that. Now, let's talk about the audience. Because for some brides, the first night of marriage wasn't spent alone in a quiet room with the door shut. It was spent under the covers, yes, but with people watching. Family members. Priests. Noblemen. Sometimes even the landlord, if the couple rented their cottage from him. Because it was important, apparently, that witnesses could confirm that the union had been consummated. You see, it wasn't enough to marry. You had to prove it. And nothing says romantic honeymoon like your mother-in-law standing at the foot of your bed, loudly praying while you and your new husband awkwardly tried to get it over with. In noble households, it was a little more ceremonial, but no less intrusive. The newlyweds would be escorted to the bridal chamber in a festive little parade, where they'd sit on the edge of the bed, drink some wine, exchange a few last pleasantries with their tipsy relatives, and then get undressed behind a curtain while everyone else filed out. Well, most of them. In some cases, especially when land, titles, or dowries were involved, a midwife or a chaperone would stay behind to make sure everything went according to plan. Some were tasked with examining the sheets in the morning for proof of virginity. And no, we don't mean emotional purity. We mean blood. Let that sink in. Now imagine being 16. You've just married a man you barely know. You've been lectured about your duties, your modesty, your holiness. You're told this act is sacred, but also sinful, required, but also shameful, and now you're being observed, or evaluated after the fact. The stakes? Your reputation, your dowry, your future. If you bled, it was proof of virtue. If you didn't, it was grounds for annulment. Or worse, accusations of promiscuity, deception, or witchcraft. No pressure. And yes, this obsession with proof wasn't just about controlling women. It was also about property, inheritance, and alliances. In other words, patriarchy disguised as piety. Because a husband needed to know that any children you bore would be his, and only his. And the only way to ensure that, was to treat your body like contested land, with every inch surveyed, marked, and signed off by committee. Imagine if today, every time a couple got married, a group of in-laws stood outside their bedroom with clipboards. That's the level of absurdity we're talking about. But for medieval women, it wasn't absurd. It was reality. And whether they feared it, accepted it, or simply endured it, the truth is, the wedding night wasn't just personal. It was public. And everyone had a stake in what happened between those sheets. By the time the candles were blown out and the last of the watchers had gone home, a medieval bride was left with a reality no song, sermon, or embroidery had prepared her for. Because no one had explained what, exactly, was supposed to happen. Not really. At best, she'd been warned. Told to be still. To obey. To close her eyes and think of duty, or babies, or God. At worst, she'd been told nothing at all. And most were somewhere in between, with a vague understanding that something would be taken, and that she shouldn't make too much noise about it. There were no diagrams. No gentle conversations. No consent workshops. Just metaphors about keys and locks, plowed fields, and the occasional terrifying caution about bearing pain with grace. And that pain was expected. Virginity was seen as a physical barrier. A medieval man was supposed to break it, like conquering a fortress. Bleeding was proof. Tears were normal. Struggling? As long as it was modest, that just made you more innocent. And if you're wondering how that sounds a little, well, criminal, yes. It does. But in the 14th century, a husband had legal rights to his wife's body. The church said so. The law said so. Her father likely made sure of it before signing the marriage contract. So whatever happened on that wedding night, whether she wanted it or not, it wasn't considered a matter of desire. It was a duty. And if she wept, she was tender. If she winced, she was delicate. If she bled, she was pure. And if she didn't, well, then she had some explaining to do. There was no script for pleasure. No expectation that it might be mutual. That it could feel good. That she might have needs, fears, questions. Those belonged to another world. One with locked garden gates and blushing poetry, but no real use inside a marriage bed. And if you think today's romantic comedies set us up for disappointment, at least they acknowledge the idea of foreplay. A medieval bride, meanwhile, was expected to lie still, bite her tongue, and pray she survived the night with her reputation, her body, and her value intact. Imagine handing someone a live electrical wire and telling them, This is holy, painful, required, and shameful, all at once. That's what it felt like. And somehow, she was expected to smile at breakfast. Yes, we do have some historical accounts, legal records, ecclesiastical manuals, and fictional portrayals that help us piece together what might have happened when a newly married couple was finally alone. The truth is, it wasn't romantic. It wasn't slow. And it rarely had anything to do with affection. In 1347, the wedding night wasn't about pleasure. It was about proof. And now, the door is closed. The guests are still awake in the next room. The fire's burning low. Her dress is stiff with embroidery, sweat stuck in the lining. Her new husband is already pulling at the laces. This is the moment everything was supposed to lead to. But if you're imagining soft lighting and whispered words, you're thinking of another century. There was rarely kissing, not the tender kind, at least. No slow build-up. No asking if she was ready. What mattered was that it happened, fast enough to report, loud enough to confirm, and preferably with a sheet that could be shown to witnesses the next day. Many grooms were drunk. That was expected. Wine was part of the celebration, and often, the consummation itself. Clergy often encouraged wine to calm the bride and strengthen the groom, which meant a fair number of first nights happened under the influence, whether she wanted to drink or not. And the pain? That was expected too. Medieval medical texts assumed that women were supposed to bleed the first time, and if she didn't, it was suspicious. But ironically, most young girls weren't given any guidance on their own bodies. She might not even know what was about to happen, only that it was her duty. Some were told to lie still. Others were advised to pray. One 14th century priest recommended that brides picture Christ on the cross to help them endure it. There were even handbooks for noblemen that described how to dominate a woman without mercy, as if the act of marriage wasn't finished until she cried. One French treatise from the late 1300s instructed noble grooms to break her pride with your seed. Yes, that's a quote. And so, for many women, that first night was not just physically painful. It was terrifying. Isolated. Confusing. He might grunt, fumble, thrust, and be finished in moments. Or not at all, and blame her for it. No eye contact. No words of reassurance. Just the sound of a latch sliding shut, and a future locked behind it. What actually happened once the door was shut? Well, that depended on who you were, how much wine was in your husband, and how badly your mother-in-law wanted a grandchild. For noblewomen, the room wasn't exactly private. Even after the guests had filed out with their giggles and jabs, even after the priest had mumbled a blessing over the bed linens, even after someone's cousin made a joke about keeping the sheets white until morning, there was still the weight of the performance. Because this wasn't about love. It was about legitimacy. The wedding night was, in many cases, the legal and theological anchor of the whole marriage. If it didn't happen, or if it didn't leave evidence, the union could be questioned, even annulled. So yes, there were cases where blooded sheets were expected as proof. Not just for curiosity, but for legal standing. And yes, this meant women were often sent into the most vulnerable moment of their lives carrying not just anxiety, but a moral obligation to bleed. As for how it happened? Quickly. Silently. Often without undressing fully. Nobles slept in linen shifts or long shirts. Nakedness was considered uncivilized, even during intimacy. You didn't shed your garments like some romantic film scene. You lifted them just enough to do what was expected. No kisses. No whispered affirmations. No candles flickering in the dark while violins swelled in the distance. Just, the sound of breathing, the weight of a man, and maybe the ache of a future pressing down before it had even begun. And for peasant women? The scene might have been less ceremonial, but no less complicated. Peasant couples sometimes had more familiarity. They might have known each other since childhood, shared bread at the same tables, even worked side by side in the fields. Some even practiced a strange custom called bundling, where engaged couples would lie in bed together, fully clothed or partially separated by a board, to get used to one another before marriage. It sounds cute, until you realize it often ended in pregnancies, and rushed weddings, and more guilt laid over everything else. Still, for some peasant couples, the wedding night wasn't their first time. That didn't mean it was romantic, but at least it wasn't always terrifying. Among nobles, though, it was rarely a matter of affection. It was about lineage, power, control. Women were vessels, not partners. Their education taught obedience, not pleasure. And their husbands, however refined, had likely been raised to view their wives as duties, not equals. So yes, there were probably a few kind men. Gentle ones. Nervous ones. Maybe even the rare man who asked, "Are you all right?" But the system wasn't built to encourage that question. It was built to silence it. And once the act was done, however it unfolded, the new wife was expected to lie still. To wait. To pray it was enough. Because in the morning, she wouldn't just be a bride. She'd be a wife. And whatever happened in the dark, it would follow her for the rest of her life. And then, came morning. The fire in the hearth had long gone out. The candles had burned low and wept into hardened wax puddles. The sheets were wrinkled. The bride's hair, pinned so carefully the day before, was now lopsided or loose. But no one cared about that. They cared about the stains. Because if you were a noble bride, the chamberlain might arrive with a pair of gloves and a ceremonial basin. The bedclothes, and any markings of virtue, were to be examined. Celebrated, even. A bloody sheet was a trophy. Proof of purity lost at the right time, to the right man. The servants might even hang the linens out a window, just so the village could be reminded that everything had gone exactly as planned. And if the sheets were clean? Well, that was trickier. Sometimes, a discreet maid would offer a splash of chicken's blood to save face, a secret all the women pretended not to know. Other times, the bride herself would be blamed. Not for lying, but for not bleeding. Because purity had to be visible, and women's bodies were expected to cooperate with public theater. And if they didn't, it was your shame to carry. Peasant weddings were simpler. There were no chamberlains, no gloves, no white linen folded into heraldic displays. But there were still expectations. Maybe your mother asked questions. Maybe your husband grunted a half-pleased nod and went off to feed the pigs. Maybe your new sister-in-law leaned over the fire and asked with too much amusement, "So? Was he kind to you?" And you, sore, hungry, exhausted, still wrapped in yesterday's fear, were supposed to smile and get on with it. Because breakfast still had to be made. Wives, noble or not, didn't get a honeymoon. No one brought breakfast in bed. No one asked how you were adjusting to married life. Instead, the morning after was the beginning of your new role, a demotion, really, dressed up as honor. From maiden to property. From daughter to asset. From person to potential womb. If you were lucky, he'd be gentle. Or at least, indifferent. If not, he might demand you again, because now he could, whenever he wanted. And the church would remind you, it was your duty to oblige him. Even if it hurt. Even if your body said no. Because after the wedding, your consent was no longer required. It had already been given, once and for all, before witnesses. And God help the woman who refused her husband in bed, that could be grounds for excommunication. So, the next time someone says the wedding is just the beginning, try not to laugh too hard. For medieval women, it really was. The beginning of obedience. Of vulnerability. Of days that never quite belonged to them again. And all of it, for a future they weren't really allowed to shape. By the second morning, maybe the third, once the bedding had been discreetly checked, and the whispers had made their rounds, the question would begin to hover in the air like chimney smoke. Was she with child? Because in 1347, the primary goal of a wedding night wasn't bonding, or intimacy, or pleasure, it was production. A woman's first job as a wife wasn't to be content. It was to be fertile. And ideally, visibly so, by the next harvest. The pressure began immediately. Even in peasant homes, where there was barely enough grain to last the week, children were expected, not just eventually, but as proof that the marriage had taken. Nobles fared no better. Land, legacy, inheritance, all of it balanced on the outcome of a womb no one truly understood. And that's the part we often forget. They had no idea how conception worked. Oh, they had theories. So many theories. Some believed a woman could only get pregnant if she enjoyed herself. Which sounds encouraging, until you realize it was mostly used to disprove rape. Others thought a woman's womb was a kind of internal oven, and that a child would only bake properly if the fire inside her body was just the right temperature. Too cold? No baby. Too warm? Deformity. Best not to ask how anyone was meant to control that. Then there was the matter of seed. The church had long debated whether women even had any. And if they did it really matter? Some thought both partners had to release seed at the same time, like lighting a candle with two matches. Others insisted that only the man's contribution counted, and the woman was just the flower pot. Cycles? Hormones? Ovulation? None of that existed, not even as concepts. Menstruation was mysterious and vaguely terrifying. Most thought it was the body releasing bad humors, blood that needed to be purged to maintain balance. Which is why, ironically, women who didn't menstruate were also seen as unwell, unless they were pregnant. In which case, hopefully the baby was a boy. There were conception calendars, charming little guides that attempted to predict a child's gender based on the moon, the time of day, and sometimes the wind. A 13th century French manual suggested Tuesday afternoons were best for boys, especially if it had just rained. And then there were charms. Potions. Prayers. Eating boiled nettles. Avoiding eels. Holding a sacred relic against your belly. Even jumping up and down after sex, or lying absolutely still with your feet in the air, just in case gravity had a say in your fate. Because no one really knew. And when no child came, month after month, season after season, it was almost never seen as a mystery. It was a failure. A failure because maybe she was cursed, maybe she was sinful, maybe her womb had been closed by God himself. Meanwhile, no one ever questioned the husband. He could be 55 and wheezing, covered in boils, missing several teeth and any discernible spark of life, and still, the assumption would be, the problem must be hers. In wealthier homes, doctors might be consulted, physicians who followed Galen or Hippocrates, who offered useful advice like, try again, or purge the system with leeches. In peasant homes, the advice came from midwives, herbalists, and great-aunts. Brew this root. Sleep under that moon. Don't touch iron on a Sunday. Everything was an omen. Everything was a risk. But above all, the pressure was unrelenting. Because the absence of a child wasn't just sad. It was suspicious. It meant something wasn't right. Something unnatural. And a woman with no children, well, she might as well start preparing excuses for Judgment Day. Even worse? If her husband grew impatient, he could always take a mistress. Nobles did it openly. Peasants did it quietly. But either way, if another woman conceived, the blame would be sealed. The proof was in the cradle. And so, many young wives spent their first year not nesting or settling, but calculating. Watching the moon. Watching their own bodies. Feeling every cramp like a condemnation. Praying for nausea. Praying for swelling. Praying for any sign that their life had been deemed fruitful enough to continue. Because in the medieval world, fertility was the foundation of marriage. And without it, you weren't just less of a wife, you were less of a woman. Even if you bled every month. Even if you tried. Even if you carried every burden and never once let go. It's hard to overstate how much medieval people misunderstood female biology. The uterus, to them, was not just an organ, it was practically a character in its own right. It wondered, it sulked, it refused to cooperate. And most of all, it remained stubbornly silent when it should have done its job. Because after a wedding, everyone was watching not just the bride, but her belly. In time. In season. With the slow suspicion of farmers watching for rain. But if the rains didn't come, if she didn't conceive, then the theories began. And oh, there were theories. Some believed conception could only happen when both parties reached a climax, a medieval footnote that somehow managed to be both surprisingly modern and thoroughly misogynistic. Because while that might sound progressive, in practice it meant one thing. If a woman didn't get pregnant, it must be her fault for not enjoying herself. The church, meanwhile, was busy debating whether women even could enjoy it. There were sermons declaring that a virtuous woman felt no pleasure at all, and others suggesting that if she didn't, she was unnatural and barren. You can imagine the whiplash. And then there was the idea of the seed. Medieval physicians, most of whom hadn't touched a living woman since birth, insisted that women had their own kind of seed, weaker, of course, and that both the male and female seed had to be in harmony. If the woman's seed was too cold, or if she sneezed too soon afterward, conception might fail. If the moon was in the wrong phase, or if she had recently seen a black cat, or eaten garlic, or harbored envy in her heart, all of these might interfere. Midwives, who actually saw what happened to women, had their own theories, often practical, passed down from older women, and just as likely to involve herbs, saints, and superstition. They might tie red ribbons around the woman's thighs. Or boil special fertility broths made with roots and ale and fragments of consecrated wafer. Some villages had designated blessed stones that a woman could sit on after intercourse, to encourage implantation. And yes, there were pelvic tilts. Long before yoga was a thing, medieval women were being told to lie still with their legs in the air. Just in case gravity helped. There was no understanding of ovulation. No idea that a woman had a brief fertile window each month. Which meant that if pregnancy didn't happen, the solution was usually more sex. As often as possible. Which, for many women, meant years of painful, anxious, and increasingly desperate nights, all to chase a miracle that no one could properly explain. A peasant woman might already be overworked and underfed, but failure to conceive made her vulnerable to gossip, cruelty, and even abandonment. Among nobles, the stakes were even higher. Marriages could be annulled, reputations destroyed, alliances broken. And if by some miracle she did become pregnant, then came the fear of losing it, because miscarriage, too, was interpreted not as bad luck or poor nutrition, but as punishment. Maybe she worked too hard, or cursed too loudly, or failed to confess a secret. Whatever the case, her womb had spoken. And people listened to what they thought it meant. All the while, the actual biology of conception remained a mystery. The egg wouldn't be discovered until 1827. Sperm, in 1677. The menstrual cycle wouldn't be charted with any real accuracy until the 20th century. Which means that for most of recorded history, women were expected to succeed at something they weren't even allowed to understand. And somehow, they still managed to do it, often, over and over again. Not because they were lucky, but because they were persistent. Because they endured. Because they trusted their bodies, or their herbs, or each other. Because they didn't always have a choice. And because sometimes, even when the science is wrong, the story still finds a way. You might imagine that after the ordeal of a medieval wedding night, the couple would be granted a little peace. A chance to recover, perhaps. To rest. To shake off the awkwardness of their first clumsy encounter and figure out how to face breakfast together. But that would be far too reasonable. Because in most places, and especially in noble households, the morning wasn't about recovery. It was about proof. And proof, in this case, meant one thing, the sheets. Yes, the bedding. Or more specifically, what was left on it. A smudge. A streak. A faint mark that would confirm what everyone had already assumed. In peasant homes, this might be a quiet affair, the mother-in-law checking the linen while the bride bathed her sore thighs in silence. But in noble circles? It was practically a performance. Sometimes, the bloody sheet was paraded like a war trophy. Sometimes it was hung from a window, like a flag declaring the woman's honor had been properly compromised. Let's just pause here. Imagine being 19, painfully sore, confused, possibly crying, and then watching a group of your relatives clap at the sight of your bodily fluids drying on a rope. There are wedding albums, and then there's this. And if there was no blood? Then things got complicated. Some women tore their own skin or pricked a finger to create it. Some families forged proof, knowing that a stain was safer than suspicion. And if nothing could be produced, well, then the whispers began. Was she already ruined? Was he not man enough? Had God withheld his blessing? You see, a wedding wasn't truly over until the community was satisfied that it had happened the way they expected it to. And this expectation went both ways. There are records of noblemen being required to publicly swear that the act had occurred, or worse, being watched through cracks in the wooden walls by witnesses, just to be sure. It was a system obsessed with honor, shame, and physical evidence, and women, of course, were the ones who bore the burden of all three. The medieval world believed that a woman's body was a vessel, but also a signpost. If her body didn't show the proper marks, then something had gone wrong. If she didn't bleed, she was questioned. If she bled too much, she might be accused of being unclean, or worse, cursed. Either way, she had no real control over what her body was supposed to say, only what others interpreted. Among peasants, the rituals were less theatrical, but the gossip was just as vicious. A midwife might be called to examine her. A neighbor might poke her stomach and offer unsolicited predictions. A friend might quietly hand over a poultice and a prayer. And if her husband was kind, or at least not cruel, she might get through the first week without being blamed for everything he didn't understand. But let's be honest. Most of the time, privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Homes were shared and rooms were open. Beds were often just piles of straw behind a curtain. Even in castles, there was always someone hovering, a servant, a sister, a steward, a priest. Always someone keeping score. So the wedding night wasn't just a private moment between two people. It was a social transaction. A public ritual. A performance judged by others, with little concern for how it felt to the woman at the center of it. And that, perhaps, is the quiet cruelty of it all. That something so personal, so raw, could be turned into something symbolic. Not a memory, but a message. Not love, but lineage. Not tenderness, but proof. And once it was over, she was no longer a bride. She was a wife. A title that came with new expectations. A different kind of silence. And a very long list of chores. It wasn't just the bed that was inspected. It was her body, her honor, her family's reputation, and her future, all laid bare for judgment in the hours after her wedding night. And if the linens came back clean, if the blood wasn't there, if the crowd of whispering servants or sharp-eyed aunts found any reason to doubt her purity, the fallout was swift, and it was devastating. Sometimes, the husband himself would call foul, claiming the bride hadn't been a virgin, and therefore the marriage wasn't valid. And medieval canon law, ever helpful, had an entire system prepared for that exact scenario. He could request an annulment on the grounds of false virginity, a lovely phrase that carried the weight of public humiliation, legal erasure, and moral damnation, all in one tidy accusation. There were courts for this. Real ecclesiastical courts, filled with scribes and bishops and parchment records, debating whether a woman had felt tight enough or bled enough to be considered legitimate. One infamous 13th century case in France dragged on for 3 years while theologians debated the thickness of a hymen and whether too much horseback riding could render a girl suspicious. And if she lost? She didn't just lose the marriage. She lost everything. Her dowry was often withheld. Her husband would be allowed to remarry, possibly to a younger, more verified bride. And she, now publicly shamed, was returned to her father's house like spoiled milk in a clay jar. Damaged goods. That was the term, and it was used without irony, because in many noble families a daughter was property, traded for alliance or land. If she couldn't fulfill her value, she was stored away, sent to a convent, or quietly buried in spinsterdom, sometimes even blamed for bringing misfortune on the entire household. No one asked if the husband had performance issues, or if he'd already been with someone else, which, let's be honest, was not uncommon. No one cared if he was violent, or drunk, or if she had been assaulted before marriage but forced to hide it for survival. The burden of proof, and the weight of blame, always fell on her. On her body. On the way it bled, or didn't. The way it looked under a candle. The way it complied with a legend she never wrote. Imagine that. Imagine your worth reduced to a cloth. A cloth held up in front of your in-laws, your servants, your village. A cloth that might save your future, or end it. And the worst part? Even if she had done everything right, saved herself, endured the pain, followed every whispered instruction from her mother or aunt, sometimes there was just no blood. Anatomy didn't care about superstition. And neither did reality. But that didn't stop the whispering. The damage was done. She would carry that stain, real or imagined, for the rest of her life. And so, that was her wedding night. Not the kind whispered about in poetry or embroidered onto a tapestry. Not the candlelit promise of union or the soft glow of intimacy that novels like to pretend was always there. It was something else entirely. A night made up of obligation and uncertainty, of whispered instructions and silent endurance. A moment she'd been raised to anticipate, yet entirely unequipped to understand, much less enjoy. The expectations were clear: she was to be modest, obedient, and, above all, intact. But the experience itself was rarely gentle, and never really hers. It belonged to the law, the church, the men who watched for proof, and the whispers that would follow if that proof never came. She wasn't meant to speak of it afterward, only to smile and go on, to bear children and bear silence. And if anything went wrong, if the pain lingered, or the blood didn't come, or the husband didn't return, she was the one held accountable. Women were punished for too much desire and punished again for not enough. Their innocence was expected, their knowledge condemned, and their emotional truth, almost never asked about. We've spent the past hour inside that impossible tangle of tradition and expectation, trying to understand what the first night of marriage truly meant for a woman in 1347. Not the fantasy, but the fear. Not the romance, but the rules. And if you're still here, still listening, still thinking about her, then perhaps part of you knows how much it mattered that someone finally said it out loud. So rest now. Let your thoughts soften. Let the past become quiet again. Because history is full of noise, but tonight, this story ends in silence. Good night. Script written by Clara Finch, because some stories still deserve a soul.